Okay, good morning, everybody. Just a few more people coming in, so we'll just give them a couple of minutes to find their seats. There you go. I think the doors are closing now, so let the games begin. Welcome everybody. My name is Trish Blake. I am Commissioner for Consumer Protection here in Western Australia, and I am facilitating this session today on the private rental market and what motivates landlords and perhaps what demotivates landlords, and also hopefully from our wise people on the panel today get some ideas about how we can tackle some of the wicked problems that are currently, or the wicked challenges that are currently facing us in the private rental market. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting here and gathering and talking today on Wajak Noongar Boodja, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us here today in this beautiful land. If you have a chance, do have a look out the windows. You'll see the Derbil Yergan outside, the Swan River, and we've certainly turned on the weather for you, we think, so you're all welcome, those of you that are visiting. So, to introduce you to our panel, we have Chris from, now, they've taken away my screen. So I'll let Chris introduce himself. Heather Holst, who's Commissioner for Residential Tenancies and Social Housing in Victoria, and Suzanne Brown, who is the President of REWA here in Western Australia and also CEO of Rent West. Chris, you are CEO of Launch
Executive Director.
Executive Director of Launch Housing, and also here representing Homeground Real Estate. So Chris, I'll hand over to you first, and if you could just do a bit of an introduction and tell us about your experience in the private rental market and what you bring today.
Sure, thank you. My name's Chris Trypas. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Solutions at Launch Housing. Launch are one of the community organisations in Australia that operate a social impact real estate agency. Before my time at Launch, I spent 15 years at Home in Place, both in New South Wales and more recently 3 years over in Aotearoa, leading the entity over there. And I hope that I can bring a fairly unique experience around how Homeground is trying to activate the private sector in a sort of profit for purpose mentality.
Fantastic, thank you. Heather.
Hi everyone. My name's Heather Holst. I will just briefly acknowledge that the lands, the traditional owners of the lands we're meeting on today, pay my respects. I'm a long way from home, and it's lovely to have started the conference with that focus. So the Commissioner for Residential Tenancies was the job I was appointed to in 2018. It's a Victorian government advisory role because there was a realisation that the perspectives of renters, residential renters, was not adequately being put into the policy-making, law-making, service delivery process. And so that's my responsibility, and among others, the responsibility of others. And I have recently had social housing and retirement villages actually added to the role as well. More on that later. But yeah, my background is in homelessness, housing, including starting Homegrown Real Estate, actually.
We didn't plan that, did we?
No, we did not plan that. That's actually just how it goes. But that's enough from me for now.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning, everyone. My name's Suzanne Brown, and I suppose I wear two hats today. I am the owner of Rent West Solutions, which is a large property management firm in Western Australia, and we handle around 2,500 homes across the whole Perth metro area. And I'm also very privileged to be in the position of REWA President, so representing around 5,500 property professionals in Western Australia, and we cover around 90% of those agents that operate in WA.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. And I think just a quick bit for me, I've been Commissioner for Consumer Protection for a couple of years now, and prior to that, I had the great privilege of being the legal policy officer that was responsible for reviewing the Residential Tenancies Act here in Western Australia, and I think I held on to that baby for about 13 years and wouldn't let anyone else near it. So because it was a great passion of mine that we try and get the settings right around renting, because housing is such a critical service, and it's a fundamental human right for people to have a roof over their head and somewhere to call home. During that time, I probably thought I knew a lot and all the answers about renting. I think over the years, though, I've learned that I've got more questions than answers, so it's perfect for me to be here asking some of the questions today. So for the panel, I thought before we begin, I'd really like us to have a bit of a chat about what we mean by private landlords, because I think that space has really changed in recent years. I think gone are the days where we were just talking about mum and dad investors who had one or maybe two rental properties, and that landscape has changed. And I think Chris and Heather particularly, you will have seen that quite a lot more on the eastern seaboard, but Suzanne, you probably are also starting to see some changes here in Western Australia. So if I could each ask you to think about what you mean by private landlords and what you see the market looking like now.
Minister. So I think from our statistics, there's about 87% just mum and dad investors, and that was traditionally the bulk of our portfolio, which they would own one property, and they were nurses, teachers, police officers. Probably what we're seeing a lot now in our Perth market, due to our market being very buoyant and there being very, very good yields, is a lot of national investment, so investment from other states. And that's quite interesting, especially when you go to sell a home, that sometimes there seems to be resistance about other people from other states buying into our market, and that does interest me. But yeah, the bulk of what we're seeing is still mum and dad investors at the moment in our portfolio.
I'm going to take the opportunity to say I don't particularly like the term mum and dad investor because it denotes a sort of unprofessionalism, hokiness that isn't okay for the provision of an essential service, which is housing. And I think it also underplays what the good private owner does as well. So, I mean, to take your question head on, Trish, for me, the private owners are just the ones who aren't providing social housing, essentially, and, in that gets included rooming houses, what do we call them here, lodging, is it? So SDA increasingly as well, specialist disability accom, some caravan owners, but for me, I'd like to sort of get us all to think about what it actually really takes to be a competent, effective, happy private owner of property, because in too many cases it's not a particularly happy experience from my observation for a lot of owners as well. And I think there's ways we can improve that.
I would just add that at home ground we're seeing people, not to use the mum and dad investor term, but owners, people looking to invest for some form of purpose, or impact. Not necessarily that they want to get into the affordable social housing space, but just that, their fees aren't padding corporate profits, they're going back into a non-for-profit and delivering more housing.
Fantastic. And then do you all see to the sort of more corporate world moving in with the build-to-rent space competing as well?
Sorry, Trish, we missed your hint before, didn't we? Yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't know the figures, but I know that build-to-rent is really starting to get underway. There's premises let now, certainly in Melbourne, and many more in the pipeline as well. And that's going to be extremely interesting, I think, to see how that all goes. At the moment, as far as I can tell, it's more a top slice of price to rent, but it delivers quality, it delivers certainty of tenure two of the things that other tenants are absolutely looking for. So we'll see, how it all settles and what it does. But yeah, you're right, it's an increasingly large contribution.
And I think, yeah, that's right. We're seeing a very small amount of it in WA, but it seems to still be at the higher end of the market. So whether it's, I think, to provide it to the lower end of the market, I think it's still very hard to make it stack up. So that'll obviously be one of the challenges moving forward for that sector.
So just taking on your point though about the mum and dad in landlords, and it is also a bane of my life that they're called mum and dad investors, because I often see it as you say, it devalues the role that they play. But I also see it from a regulator perspective as a bit of an excuse to we don't need laws, or laws don't regulate us because we're just a mum and dad, so leave us alone. And it belies the fact that they are providing an essential service. So I like to see them as small businesses. Yeah. You're running a small business, so maybe we can start to think in terms of small and medium enterprises. So we go small being the individuals and the medium being the build to rent space. We can start to think about that. So I guess my next question is, and Chris, this is probably one you're really well set today, the profit motive that drives landlords, or that we hear that drives landlords, is that incompatible with a sustainable rental market, do you think?
I would say in Melbourne, no, because there's such high rental yield and, investment is generally good because property is still affordable. I would say it's really important we've found it successful to really define what profit and what impact is, because there is absolutely a market out there for people who want to give back. They may not want to give back in the, all the way down the housing continuum, but just to know that, their management fees are going to something good, I think is important. The second part of that around, being an appropriate landlord is understanding the obligations. So it's really important to front end that discussion with someone, a lead that comes through. It's important to sort of front end that and get them to understand their obligations, not just from a legislative point of view, but also what our obligations are as an entity that's representing their property and how we go about doing things.
Suzanne, in WA, I think we've seen quite an epic trajectory of rents to the point where we're now almost the second most expensive city to rent. So how do you reflect on that in terms of, I think twofold. One, is that sustainable as our market if we rely so heavily on the private rental market and we see how it has handled this, from COVID onwards, but also how is it for property managers who are working in that space, because I imagine it puts them in a rock and a hard place sometimes.
It does, and I think, yes, we have seen a huge trajectory in rents, although it is really important to keep in mind that we came off a very low base and we had rents decline for quite a few years. So landlords were just, sometimes they were playing catch up, but obviously, rents have since increased since then. And yes, I think in Perth we've definitely hit an affordability ceiling. We're now hovering around the $680 a week, and we're just seeing, anything too high. There's just no appetite there, or just no general affordability. So we do have to educate landlords that even though they might have been told by sales agents or told that their property's worth this is actually the reality in the market. So yeah, and then the other thing is, I say to Trish quite often, we would, as property professionals, we would much rather work in a balanced market, which is around a vacancy rate of 3.5%, rather than we're currently at 2.2. We did spend quite a few years around the 1%, which was. It is very, very challenging to work in, as I said, as a property professional. You are the rock in between a rock and a hard place. You're trying to deliver a professional service, and obviously you're trying to meet the needs of both the tenant and the owner, educate the owner, and obviously educate the tenant of where the market's at now. But we all know, I think, at the basis of that problem is supply, and you know, it's very hard to go to work every day. I know with my team, when you're delivering rent increases to people you know can't afford it, but you've got an obligation to that landlord, but you've also, or to the owner, but you've also got, you know, that we need to keep that property in the market to continue the supply and continue to ease the supply issue. When you're turning up to home opens and you've got, you know, between 20 and 40 people lined up, everybody is desperate, everybody's got a story. They're hounding you before that home open and they're hounding you after. Once their application's in, it is a very, very demanding role, and it is very, very challenging. So from the private sector, you know, I know I speak on behalf of all property managers, we would much rather see a balanced market than to work in this, because there's not many enjoyable parts of the job day to day.
Heather?
I would just can really relate to that. Just add that the private market's being asked to do too much, and the conversation earlier, particularly Ben Rimmer, talking about what's happening with social housing supply, that needs to come up so much more that that some of that pressure, you know, the rebalancing has to sort of be there, as does more access into home ownership for first home buyers as well. And that's actually one of the things that Victoria has got more going on with. Victoria's stat I like has got 10% more first home buyers, you know, getting in than the next state. So that's another part of the rebalancing that I think needs to be looked at. The other thing I think is that owners and would-be owners need to be able to get really objective, effective advice and information about what they're getting into and what they are into as things change. I'll get another hobby horse out at this point, Trish, which is registration. I think we should have, or you know, property owners should be registered so that they can be. Oh, thanks, someone else. So that they can be directly communicated with. You know that you have to register for so many other things, but you don't have to deliver housing as a, you know, it's extraordinary. And the people really understand what their margins are, how much they should be reserving for repairs, how to keep your asset up to standard. I mean, you as community housing providers all have asset management plans. Do private owners think in those terms? Yeah, so I think rather than being on the back foot, ad hoc, being shocked by the sort of bills that do or don't come in, the feeling needs to be taken out of it by much better knowledge and education, and that would relieve some of the pressure on the agents too if they weren't the ones having to deliver that bad news a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I must say, certainly during COVID, when prices were going through the roof, one of the biggest complaints we would see via our Minister's office would be from landlords who were saying that their property manager wasn't getting them the rent that they had been told by somebody else that they would be able to get. And we had to explain that rent is a feature of market forces and their house is only worth what people are prepared to pay. And just on the register thing, certainly in our consultation on our legislation that we are still working our way through, that was one of the questions we looked at, was a register of private landlords, because certainly in Ireland and Scotland, you have to be registered before you can deliver, as you say, quite an essential service. And I would say as a regulator, we already have a register of all the property managers out there. So it seems to me only fair because we licence them. So it seems perhaps an equalling or levelling of the playing field. Picking up on your point, Heather, around and continuing on from this economic sustainability, repairs. I think that's, again, one of the biggest areas of complaint that we would get through as a regulator is from tenants who need repairs done to the property, but we then end up with a landlord who says, I can't afford to do. There's those landlords that just refuse to do repairs, and that's a different cohort, but I guess I'm talking about the people who can't afford to do repairs because potentially financially they've got in over their heads themselves. And I might say we recently had an advertisement in the Perth metropolitan area, because it actually made the news, of a house that was advertised at $600 a week for rent, which is not at the top end, but for this particular suburb it's pretty pricey. And it was advertised as having rising damp, but the owner had no intention of fixing it. So they figured that if they put that in the ad, then that meant they didn't have to do anything about it. So Heather, I'll start with you and we'll jump around on this. How do we, because also having tenants that are paying 50, 60% of their income in rent surely can't be healthy for a landlord as well, who then has tenants who get behind in their rent. You then, Suzanne, you would know, and Chris, you then have all the court proceedings of terminating and recovering rents and stuff. So how do we get people to that financially sustainable sweet spot?
Scotland has, the aforementioned kind of here's the real picture, There probably are a few landlords who shouldn't be landlords either. Frankly, their attitude isn't probably redeemable, just to be frank. Scotland has a fund where for major repairs a landlord can borrow at no interest from it, so when you've got a real big hurdle one, because you do want to keep these properties in play, absolutely, and you want to keep them in play without giving everyone bronchial infections all the time, don't you? So I think that's something to look at. Scotland's, generally speaking, something to be looked at, actually, with their housing policy, as you probably know, Trish, yeah. So that's just a few thoughts I would have, but I think the start is to be extremely clear about what's needed and what's expected and what's legal. I mean, you just also have to have that at certain points. There's a bottom line, can't be gone below, yeah. A renting task force has begun in Victoria, actually it's nearly a year ago now, going and inspecting for minimum standards and issuing fines. People need to understand it's not just a piece of information, it's actually a legal enforceable flaw that needs to be met. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it's important to remember that it's still only a very small part of, the majority of landlords are really good property owners and do the right thing. Yes, there has been definitely, we've seen a section of owners that have purchased property when the interest rates were 1.98%, and they're definitely feeling the impact of now what the interest rates are coming off those loans, and their cash flow is very, very tight, and that is impacting, totally appreciate that's impacting tenants and repairs. And I'm very lucky. I'm at a stage of my business where I can afford to turn away business, and I probably do one landlord a month where, the team are very happy. That doesn't fit our values because, tenants are paying a premium rent, and if the owner can't afford to conduct those repairs or let us manage that property effectively, doesn't solve the problem because they just go generally to another provider. I think part of what we're seeing seems to be exacerbated because there seems to be this influx of wealth creators, buyers agents who seem to pop up on TikTok or Instagram saying you can make a lot of money buying a property in Perth. Again, the education's not there. Some are buying in their super fund. They have no cash flow. They're relying on cash flow of their super fund. And yeah, that really impacts it. And I have all the time, I have buyers agents going, I can give you so many rentals, how much you're going to pay me? And I go, guys, we get paid $10, pretty much $10 a week. Like, we're the lowest paid in the whole food chain of that whole real estate cycle. So I don't know what makes you think we can afford to give you kickbacks for putting a client us. They don't ask what our arrears are. They don't ask what our, what our systems are, what our, procedures are. They just who's paying the most fee to them. So I think that has caused a lot of the problem with these uneducated landlords. It is a very small percentage. Majority of people do really want to do the right thing, want to look after their tenants. We send out a newsletter just before Christmas, and we probably have 150 that want to send their tenant a gift card, a hamper, or something, and thank them for being good tenants. So there is, yeah.
I'd just probably add, from our experience, the beauty of an impact agency is that it's often backed by the support of a community housing provider, so we can exercise a little bit of discretion at times in terms of if a landlord does get into some sort of financial strife and whatnot, we have a multi-trader that we can refer them to. We also have the provisioning, apart from a broken tap, we would also, a major, maintenance event, it might be more beneficial for them to, rather than them having an upfront expense, we just deduct it at month end. But we've also seen the experience where there's that idea of a non-for-profit social impact. So I'll give you my stock, I'll bring my stock to you that the mainstream market wouldn't take. So we've found it really important to sort of get out there into the properties before we're sort of vetting our leads, because unfortunately, not all the time, but sometimes, you know, some investors see that, oh, I don't have to keep the property to an appropriate standard. I'll go to an impact or a non-for-profit agency who might put a social housing tenant, but that's not our model. But yeah, it does exist, those landlords, and I call them cowboys and nobody likes them. Yeah.
So it seems to me, I mean, one of the things that we're talking about here too is a bit of a cultural shift, or quite a significant cultural shift across many aspects of the market. So, you know, we've got some good property managers here that are saying, you know, they were quite selective about properties, but I'm assuming there's a lot of property managers out there too who, and agents who, and these buyers agents who are wanting to push. We've got some landlords who, and not many, but want to offload their less desirable housing to either not-for-profit or just continue to rent it out with an advertisement that says, you can have it, I'm not going to fix it, but this is what I'm charging you for it anyway. I think one of the other things that I see as a need for a bit of a cultural shift, I'm interested in this, is what I consider the scourge of the 6 and the 12-month leases. It's interesting that there is nothing in any legislation anywhere that says rental leases should be 6 months or 12 months. And I think for a lot of tenants who would really like longer term leases, and I think this is where the build to rent market is finding its niche, we're looking at people who are now, you know, renting for long stages of life, and particularly, you know, if you're an older person and you're near medical care, you want to be able to put down roots and maybe make amendments, you know, minor adjustments to the house so it's livable. If you've got children in school, you want to be able to them to see out their schooling years in that one rental. How can we incentivise the rental market to just jump in on these longer term opportunities, or at least use less of these 6 and 12-month leases as the way forward? And are there barriers? Do we even need, again, if I go to, I think it's Scotland, don't even have fixed term leases anymore. Everyone's on a periodic lease, and as long as you're doing the right thing and you're happy to be there and there's no life change for the landlord, everything continues. So just curious.
Oh, I do have a few ideas, of course. So we're just about to get rid of no reason notices to vacate at the end of the first term in Victoria. So that was still there. Other no reason notices were taken out in the last few years, but that one was still there. So that's a really good way to keep a shorter term, the first term that people get. So that'll be a very interesting experiment as to whether that helps. From the tenant's side, the renter's side, they can be nervous of entering into a longer one because they don't know if they're going in with an owner and an agent that will be good to them, that will be responsive, not, you know, do all the things. So the tight protections for renters' rights are very important from that trust point of view too. We actually put longer leases into residential tenancies law. I think it was enacted in 2020, but it's hardly any take-up. Yeah, hardly any. The lengths of tenure are stretching out, but that's got a lot to do with people not being game to move because of the tight market, not really necessarily great reasons, yeah. So I think a combination of getting rid of that no reason notice at the beginning, first term, and tight protections to make sure that people, if they do, you know, they are having a good experience on both sides. And also that if a break does need to be made, it can be made without it being incurring the whole cost of the rest of the term if it's a longer term. And that's another thing that's actually happened in Victoria. We've brought in shorter sort of amounts that have to be paid for a break. So I think it's a few different angles, but like you were remarking before, Trish, it's another cultural one, I think. But it is offering someone a home and someone seeking a home. So the presumption ought to be, as far as we can get to, as long as everyone needs it.
Chris, you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this from an investor's point of view. You spoke very heavily about the renter experience. And I think to incentivise someone, it's just about being upfront. You know, I think you use the word life change for a landlord. As long as those provisions are there to support them, that education from a managing agent point of view becomes very simple in terms of the conversation that Suzanne and I are having with landlords around, you know, these are your expectations. We want this to be long-term sustainable. We want to get you a renter that's going to be there for the long haul and look after your property as your own, as long as they have that exceptional provision that if, you know, excuse my French, shit hits the fan, they can make what they need to support their own family in some cases. So I think that's really important, depending on the state of jurisdiction, that those reasons for ending are really clear and defined and, you know, easy read for what is sometimes someone who is not a property professional who's sort of entering into the market.
So yeah, sure, because in Victoria we see some of the grounds being that the landlord needs to move back in themselves, or that their family needs to move back in, or that. So they're the sorts of grounds that you're talking about?
Absolutely,
Yep,
yeah.
Yep. Suzanne?
To be honest, we haven't seen a 6-month lease for a long time, and obviously that's dependent on the market, and people are, I don't think people would, I mean, we don't sign a landlord up for under between 12 months and 2 years, so a tenant, I don't think in this market would take a 6-month lease. By the time they've moved in, they're having to relook for another property. And what we're seeing is lease renewals happen a lot earlier than when they're coming up for renewal. So a good 6 months prior to their either their expiry or their renewal discussion, tenants are on the front foot saying, can we lock in a longer term? That seems to happen again after that 12-month period where everybody's comfortable with the status quo. You know, the tenant's happy, they haven't got an unreasonable landlord, they haven't got an unreasonable property manager, their kids are happy in the school, and for an owner, they're really happy with the tenant and the relationship continues. We did see a few 6-month leases, especially in WA, because our population, our workforce was a little bit transient. There was seemed to be a lot of people on contracts, and at that time, seemed to be just after COVID, people were asking for 6-month leases because they said, I've got a six-month contract with BHP. I don't want to be have the uncertainty of not, you know, having employment after that and having to go back to Victoria, have to go back to another state. So the demand for a 6-month lease was driven by a tenant. Never ever would you have an owner really, or very rarely. You might have a 12-month lease, they're going around Australia and they're making their home available for 12 months. We will take that on at the moment, wouldn't necessarily in the past, but because one more houses, you know, one more family, we're very clear. This owner has gone away, it is available for 12 months, but right at the minute we need supply and we will make those concessions available. But yeah, the 6-month lease, I think, is for both parties is hopefully long gone.
Yeah. Do you have a sense, though, that at the end of the first fixed term that there's a greater willingness to move into a periodic tenancy?
Oh, not a periodic, no, but definitely a longer term. After that initial, everybody seems to be, and it does happen for both parties. You know, as I said, schools, we have people move because their children don't like the school and they don't want to be fixed into a long-term lease. They want to have the ability to move, you know, to another location, to a different school when their kids are going to high school versus, you know, they might want to move to another area where that school's more desirable. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess the periodic lease gives them that flexibility, but I guess in WA too, which brings me to my next question, is that elephant in the room of no grounds terminations, and we still have it here. I think that's probably one of the things why tenants don't nominate to go onto a periodic and would rather a fixed term to give them some sense of certainty of tenure. So Heather, you raised before about Victoria is about to get rid of their last no grounds terminations clause. I guess what I'm curious about from all of your perspectives is I understand why some landlords and property managers like to have the no grounds termination there. It's kind of that it's kind of that last resort catch-all when other things don't work. And I get, and I guess if we look at the rental market again, when you're saying majority of landlords want to do the right thing, I think we can all acknowledge too that the majority of tenants are really good tenants and just get on and do their thing and pay their rent and don't annoy the neighbours and so forth. So what do you think we can do to create a situation where there's more support for those tenants that can't perhaps cope in mainstream tenancies, and for the communities around them as well, and for the landlords that are responsible for them, so that in effect we're not holding the 80-90% of tenants who are doing the right thing to ransom or under fear of that sort of quick termination. So we effectively could get rid of no grounds termination. So keen to know how it goes from Victoria's perspective, and Chris, how you, as a landlord or a head of a big landlord, and Heather, your insights, and then Suzanne, what you think from a WA perspective we could do.
I might start from a community housing lens, because over the past 15 years, I mean, you know, it's rare that a community housing provider will utilise a no grounds termination. I know, you know, I haven't used one for a very long time, and while I was in New Zealand, we didn't have that provision, so it's like going from New Zealand to Victoria is nothing new for me. I think it speaks to the importance of collaboration within community. So I'm sure Suzanne as well, even though you're managing a mainstream rental business, you've probably got really strong connections with local services and, you know, referrals that your property managers can make if, you know, renters are sort of in financial stress and things like that. All of those sort of partnerships are really critical to not using sort of a no grounds from a renter sustainability point of view.
I just think there has to be a grounds. Why are you evicting a person if you're an owner? Why? And that has to be, you know, it has to be codified in the Act. And in the Victorian Act, there's plenty of reasons people can get evicted. I just think it's a fundamental, strange loophole that sort of shows the unbalancing of you know, the Act, where the Acts have been. Just to be quite frank with you there. So I think there should not be. Say what you're doing, and if you can't say and defend what you're doing, don't do it.
I think in our case, you know, you've got to understand we build up a lot of times, have a lot better relationship with our tenants than our owners. You know, we do inspections 4 times a year in WA. Obviously for a longer term tenant, we would cut those down. But we're in their homes, we're celebrating their life events, you know, we're speaking to them, you know, probably weekly, sometimes twice a week, we're a lot more often than our owners. So there is very rarely a time when we would end a tenancy, or it comes to its natural end. There is very rarely a time where we would not give that tenant the courtesy of knowing why that tenancy has to end at the expiry of the lease. That's just common courtesy to anybody. And I think, again, the impact on property managers, we're well aware. We're taking someone's basic need away from them by doing that. We are taking the roof over their head and that opportunity of that home that they're built away. So we don't do it lightly, and it's under instructions from the owner. And again, there's generally a very, very good reason why they need it. Either you know, they need to move a family member in, they need to move in themselves, it's being sold, and I suppose that comes, Trish, we've had that discussion, I suppose if all of those grounds can be in there, and I suppose we're doing it already. We're doing it without it being legislated. We are giving people the courtesy of knowing, you know, why their home is being taken away from them, and as I said, that impact on, you know, the people doing that role is significant. So, yeah, I think it's my only concern, and probably why we are vocal against it. As an institute, I suppose we feel it will impact supply, and we will do everything we can to fight for supply in the market at the moment, because there doesn't seem to be too many levers, and I know this is part of these 3 days, that the government can pull quickly to provide housing, you know, with the desperate need we have right at the moment.
So just to build on that issue of supply, it's something I'd be curious to hear from Victoria's experience. But Suzanne, so in terms of a lot of our landlords, our private landlords, and particularly ones that operate under property managers, how aware are they of the legislation itself, so that if there was a legislative change to say you can't have no grounds, but then you move to this list of grounds, how much do you think that would actually impact, or where do we know that will impact on a lot of? There's undoubtedly a few landlords, because even with the pets and minor modifications we've seen, we've had some mail from a few landlords, not much, but a few that haven't liked the government interfering in their business. But I guess I'm just curious as to what extent, because a lot of landlords don't seem to know the legislation, so I'm curious as to what extent a change in that would actually impact on supply.
On supply, I think, and I know I'm not going to be very popular, I think it's just layers and layers of more regulation that's put on private investors. And, you know, I think we did see after COVID and the extra legislation or extra regulations put on them, there was an exit from the market, and that hasn't helped where we are today. And I think, you know, I had quite a few owners say to me, well, I'll go and put my money, I'll sell my home, go and put my property, go and put my money in the share market, because nobody dictates to me what I can and can't do around that. Yes, obviously they invest in an ASX listed company, which they're at that mercy, but I think that's the conversation that seems to be coming, you know, from the landlords I speak to. There's also a little bit of resistance about constantly owners being demonised as doing the wrong thing, you know, and a lot of them, that's very hard to take, because as I said, the majority are trying to do the right thing. There's quite a few providing rents at affordable rents, not hiking up rents where they could, you know, investing, obviously creating their wealth through investing in homes, but also understand they are doing some social good by providing housing. So that constant, I suppose, media rhetoric that, you know, where we do demonise landlords, they're greedy, they're unreasonable, you know, doesn't help, I think, people that are trying to do the right thing.
Just on that, if I could jump in, that friction and heat won't go till the supply side gets better, and it's actually one of the really bad things. You know, the community members are kind of against each other. It's really bad, I reckon. But it's how it is while the supply is so low. There's a lot of pushback on extra regulation in the media in Victoria as well, and Victoria's often kind of put out there as the one who's most inclined to do this, and you know it's terrible. But actually, the figures from the State Revenue Office show that just as many investors have got, there are as many investment properties still there. They may not be held by the same investor, but if they're an existing property, they're either going to be held by another investor or they're going to be held by a first home buyer. They're not going to disappear. It's more to do with new housing supply, that maybe there's some fears. I don't understand what that would be. But if someone wants to sell because they feel that they're over-regulated, well, perhaps they should. And another investor or a first homeowner will buy it. Yep.
Just, you know, to touch on that, I would agree that landlords cop a bad rap at times. So what do? We capitalise on that. So what we've sort of done in an impact space is, you know, make your investment have impact. So rather than being seen as a wealth generating, even though it is, like we provide a market service and we, you know, charge fees and we'll charge rent that's appropriate, your fees that you're paying are going back into community benefit. So whether it's a landlord telling their friend that, or telling someone, making them feel better personally about the decisions that they're making, that social impact, unique value proposition is really quite enticing, we've seen in the last probably 6 to 12 months.
So another cultural shift.
Yes.
So, Chris, so then because I know we don't have a home ground here in Western Australia, if someone was interested in that service emerging in WA, what would that look like? What would be your takeaway message to them?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, you know, what's that saying? Rome wasn't built in a day. A lot of, you know, myself included, prior to my launch journey, sort of understood that a social impact real estate sort of would just get kick-started by some affordable rentals or purchasing a rent roll from the mainstream. It's a whole lot more than that. There's a lot of, you know, really critical business decisions that need to be made, because you don't sort of want this value add that's not achieving its purpose by generating profit. Of course, happy to have the conversation. There's a home ground in Sydney and a home ground in Canberra, and that's where sort of a licensing arrangement between community housing providers have allowed them to sort of access the brand and the IP. It's really important, but our model is around, we are a, you know, CAVS registered real estate agent. Our primary sort of target is not you know, social and affordable rental. It's really capitalising on investors that want to see their profit go into impact and the work that Launch Housing does. And that can be a paradox at times in terms of working in that, because sometimes investors hear non-for-profit, sometimes people in Melbourne hear Launch Housing, and the first thing that our property managers say is, you're not going to put a launch tenant in my rental. And I know that's probably the elephant in the room, but there is a huge amount of stigma that is carried by social and affordable housing. So it's almost an indirect social impact. It's market housing with your profits going to purpose. But yeah, I don't see a reason why it couldn't happen in Western Australia, but I would just say tread carefully and get your scale right, because at a smaller scale it's probably not tenable.
There you go, WA people, there's your challenge. What I will do now is open it up to the room for some questions, and then I'll come back to the panel for their final kind of takeaway. It's a bit like Insiders on the ABC. What's your final takeaway for the week? Do we have anyone that has questions? So we've got a question over here. Just wait, the volunteers will come and bring you a microphone. Over here. Okay, keep coming down. Thank you. There you go. Bingo. If you could just state your name as well and where you're from.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a fantastic panel discussion. My name is Wendy Stone. I'm from Swinburne University in Melbourne. And I watch the private rental sector very firmly with an aspirations lens. We've done a lot of research in our area through Ahuri as well that really looks at the aspirations of people in the housing system, including people who are renting privately or who seek to be, as well as people who invest in the private rental sector. And leaning into this cultural change, I'm wondering whether the aspiration around stabilising and developing a win-win situation for all people could even go further on the linguistics here. So we talked a bit about mum and dad investors, or you did at the beginning. I'm wondering, in contemporary Australia, I doubt that we would choose the term landlord today if we were really thinking about what we would describe people investing in this sector as. And I'm also not sure that market rules are necessarily the way to go. I'm wondering a broad reflection about changing the culture towards a win-win around thinking about housing providers in a private rental sector. Could that enable better education for investors, better compliance rights and responsibilities for those people, as well as a sort of more sure home for people living in private sector housing? Thank you.
I have to start. Thanks, Wendy. Nice to see you. Well, Victoria in the 2018 changes attempted to change the name landlord to residential rental provider, RRP, which is a very government piece of work, isn't it?
It's a mouthful.
Quite funny. Residential rental provider. But yeah, I mean, it's very active, Elizabeth, the landlord type of term, and doesn't help. I think it sort of drags it back. Probably part of that discourse you were talking about before, you know, of people being hated on for being owners of property is what it kind of reflects. So just a few comments there. I think there's maybe the language change will be after some of the rebalancing. Maybe people will really take on new language then, but yeah, it certainly needs to be looked at. Yeah.
And I've been in the industry 35 years, so if I call out landlord, it's because it's, you know, yeah, force of habit. Obviously, you know, we have owner and tenant in our legislation, and we, you know, we educate our owners a lot of times. We say, we know it's your house, but it's actually your tenant's home. So we really go to town on explaining that. And the other part of the question, sorry, I forgot, was market. Yes, yeah.
System, rights and responsibilities, thinking about it like...
Yeah, so obviously we have an act, but you're obviously saying more on that, more... Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think I can add something valuable here in terms of our impact agency. You know, part of that education piece is, you know, messaging, like the first message, then once they're like the owners engage, then explaining all of the specific, whether it's, you know, a tier 2 affordable housing with a tax benefit ruling and things like that. So we've taken a really targeted approach to the language that we use. And, you know, we very readily understand that, you know, that sort of conversation is not for all property owners. It can change depending on the person that presents. Some people are after set and forget long term. Other people that are wanting to make an impact, they actually want quite an involved relationship with their property manager and understanding who's going into their rental. So, and I don't know if it's an impact thing, but we've been able to sort of tailor the language and the way that we sort of liaise with our property owners.
I think, yes, Suzanne, and for both of you, coming back to that concept earlier, when we did our review of this recent residential tenancies, the title of the review was Your House, My Home. And we actually got quite a bit of pushback on that from a lot of landlords because they didn't see it as the tenant's home. Like it's the landlord's asset. Is a very firm mindset. So I guess that is a bit of work that we still need to do in this space, and goes back to my earlier issue about we need to remind people they're actually offering a small business, so it's a service that they're offering. And if we put the Australian consumer law lens onto it, there's certain things they wouldn't be allowed to do that they're currently doing under the Residential Tenancies Act. So it is really good if we can start to change some of that language. Do we have some other questions? Just behind you there in the blue shirt. Thank you.
Thank you. And my name's Angela Cartwright. I'm CEO of Better Renting. And I will say it's a bit disappointing that there isn't someone on the panel who is representing their experience as a renter. And there's been a few comments made kind of on behalf of renters. And I think some of them were, you know, really valid and do reflect what renters experience and what many renters want. But I think picking up on the conversation around no grounds evictions, certainly what we're hearing in New South Wales, which has introduced restricted grounds for evictions, is it's not really working well at all, which is in part because the reforms were watered down really before they even began, but also because without any rent stabilisation policies to protect renters against extreme rent hikes, we know there's huge flow-on effects in terms of renters not being willing to report, you know, really significant repairs and maintenance because they know they can't afford another rent increase. So it is important that we get rid of no grounds evictions, but it has limited efficacy, I guess, when rents are still going up. And I think there was a lot of fanfare around domain data. We don't see these as particularly positive outcomes for renters just yet. And I think the other part about no grounds evictions that really doesn't work for renters is that we're still seeing the investor's rights as being more important than the person living in the home. And as you said, Suzanne, you know, you're educating your landlords to say that it is the renter's home. So I guess the question is, why is it more important that an investor can sell a home without a tenant than a human can live in that home? And why does a relative of an investor have more right to move into a home than the person already living there? It is an investment. We've kind of created this golden goose of investment with property, and I think this is the cultural shift we need to address. We don't need to see longer leases. We need periodic leases with very, very limited grounds for ending a tenancy, so that the renter is in control of when the tenancy ends. In all but the most extreme circumstances, there are hardship support payments available for renters. There are hardship supports available for landlords. And we, of course, need to see that, you know, we have registration and education. So it is holistic. We need all of these things together, but we also need to hear the voices of renters in these conversations.
I suppose always my concern with extra levels of legislation, I take on board all of what you've said, is you obviously we have the intent of the legislation or the regulations or the changes, and then we have the impact. And Heather will correct me if I'm wrong on any of my stats, but talking to some people in Victoria, I think you've got a rental pool of about 600,000 homes, would that be right?
A bit more, but yeah.
A bit more, okay. And then I think we've seen potentially from the taxation changes, I think around land tax and different regulatory changes, there's been an exit of about 3%, am I right there?
There's still a lot of work going on trying to work out what's going on, but it does appear to be less bonds being lodged. Yeah.
So in a market such as if I just speak from WA, because that's my own experience, we can't afford a 3% exit from the market. So that's all I say. With every bit of legislation, there's the intent of the legislation, and then there's the unintended consequences that come with it that are very, very hard to reverse, and very, very hard, if we do see an exit from the market, very, very hard to get that supply, which is already constrained, back into the market. It's not a quick turnaround. If it's same with negative gearing, and I know I'm not going to be popular, but we can operate in any market, but if it does have those unintended consequences and investors do exit the market, like they did in 1985 or 87, that'll be catastrophic for a hell of a lot of tenants. And I think that a lot of times the people we're trying to protect and the people we're trying to put this legislation in for ends up hurting them the most. That's my comment around that one. But you would probably
just make a couple of comments. One is that we are seeing cases where, if it's taken to VCAT, where people are allowed to stay in the property while a sale goes on. It used to be the norm that sales occurred with people in the property, with tenants in the property. It isn't the norm anymore. So I think there's something that is possible there. And then I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that it's a common law principle that people have the right to acquire and dispose of property, of their assets. So we come right down to a sort of a bedrock legal principle of Australia about property, private property. And that goes back to some of the other comments, I suppose, that were made about how much the private sector is being asked to do in rental, or has not being asked to do, is doing, and not always very well. Yeah. Sorry, I missed where you were from, Angela. Is it?
Better Renting, so we're a national
Renting.
organisation.
Okay.
Yeah. We're a community of renters.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I missed it.
Do you have anything you wanted to add?
Just that I would echo Angela's comments around the rent setting legislation and increases. We try and have that conversation up front. if you're wanting to rent for impact and long-term sustainability, don't come to us in 12 months and try and jack the rent up, because it's not going to happen. Yeah.
So, and how do you find that your landlords take that conversation? Because obviously...
Yeah, and look, you know, to caveat that, a lot of the people that are investing in home ground, they're not your young people with significant investment loans. Often they may have come into a property, inherited a property, and think, oh, I've got this asset now, how can I give back? So, you know, caveating my comments with that, it's probably an easier conversation than with someone that's had a huge interest rate hike, for example, and they're just trying to balance the books.
Yep. I think we had a question down here. Sorry, come down here first. Keep coming.
Hi, Andy Dennis from Anglicare NT. I've been responsible for running some head lease programs with varying degrees of success, often a lack of knowledge around what a head lease actually looks like. But it opens up the potential for increased supply of housing for landlords or owners, sorry, I won't use landlords, owners to have a social impact while receiving full market rent. I see them as a very valuable tool in the box for affordable housing, and as a community housing provider, we can also provide intensive support to those tenants, whereby they may in fact even take over the tenancy at the end of the head lease. Why can't we make this work?
I might start on that, having quite a bit of experience in the old CHLP program in New South Wales, managing in excess of 500 private rentals with 500 different landlords. I would say it's harder to make that work in comparison to a model like Homeground. It's because of the varying degree and what I would say always increasing complexity of a social housing renter, and managing that expectation with the private landlord that the sell or the UVP of a head lease arrangement is not that of, oh, you're going to get market rent for, it's about that impact, that you're going to be helping a vulnerable person potentially, you know, playing your part in reducing the social housing wait list. I don't know what the UVP, but the idea of them coming in going, oh, I want guaranteed rent, they're not the right landlord or renter. Sorry, I'm second guessing myself with landlord. They're not the right owner for a head lease style program. That would be my experience in it.
I think we have a lot of experiences in that case, not with Anglicare, but definitely with NDIS providers. They take a head lease and they have, tenants that are coming in and out. We work a lot with women's refuges, where we try and quarantine. It's getting very hard, but quarantine any affordable rentals that come through before they get advertised. We offer them to those groups so they can see if they've got a suitable tenant, and then it's about us educating the landlord why they should, about considering that tenant. And then there's lots of Centrecare. We did a lot with Centrecare, who were bringing in a lot of refugees, and they would take the head lease. So it did work. It did work very, very well. And I think there's also, and again, I'm not trying to give more incentives to private landlords, but I think there's also an opportunity where people that want to be an impact landlord and do want to provide their rental at an affordable rate to a tenant could maybe have some compensation or some discount on the council rates, on their land tax. I think that would be a very quick way with the government to be able to incentivise those landlords to bring their rents down, to provide housing to a lot of vulnerable people that need it. So, did
you have anything else?
I think those are great remarks, and probably it's better as a short-term boost-up while properties actually acquired into social housing or whatever is needed, because of that point at which the owner will want to trade out at some stage, and that can be really difficult. which I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking in particular, Chris, but you know, that is hard, yeah.
Can I just add just to your comment, the acquiring thing is just a vicious circle, because I've had property in our rent roll that's up for sale and owners had to sell it, and Department of Housing have bought it. They've displaced our tenant who was probably on their wait list, but maybe way down the bottom. So, you know, those solutions really I struggle with, because, you know, it just doesn't really help anyone. I think in WA we've definitely got, in our further suburb, which is Yanship and Two Rocks, which is a new subdivision, newly built homes, there's 90 properties vacant there, starting from $330 a week. There's a very, very expensive Metronet that's been built that takes people there, but people still don't want to live there yet. So we desperately need the infill. We need a median density infill, because we know that high density isn't really stacking up at the moment with construction costs and the really constrained construction centre, construction workforce, yeah. So median density, we need to really unlock some lazy land. Again, it's more building, which is time, but we need to come up repurposing building. There's a whole host of things that we really need to be a lot more creative with to get homes where people want to live, not an hour and a half away.
Definitely. I think we had a question up the, was there one up the back there? Yep, that gentleman, and then there's one down the front here.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to everybody. My name's Peter. I work for Mission Australia and also for the Western Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. I have been a homeless person. I've lived in social housing. I've lived in private rentals. I've also bought, at one point, an investment property. I'd like to come at it from a moralistic point of view. And my experience as being an owner of an investment property. I was constantly, by the management company, told that I should be increasing my rent. For me personally, if I was covering my mortgage and I'd put a little bit aside for any maintenance, that was my investment. I had long-term tenants that looked after the property, paid their rent on time, and for me, that was enough. And I'm just wondering, there's a lot of people that take the opportunity to perhaps charge a lot of rent where perhaps they don't need to. So for me personally, it was a moral thing. My tenants were young people, and hopefully I gave them the opportunity to actually put money aside to buy their own property and to make a future for themselves. So I think personally, if we were to have more people that had a moral perspective on it, instead of like a big money-making venture, it might perhaps be a little bit better for people. That's really all I wanted to say. Thanks.
I think we had a question down the front here, did we? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Ryan. I'm the Director of Housing at Aboriginal Housing Victoria. Firstly, as someone who rents, congratulations, Heather, on the changes you've made in Victoria. I do think it will have a benefit for those of us who are trapped in the rental market for now, fingers crossed. I think the sticky thing in the room is that you've got two conflicting concepts happening. We're talking about the private rental market and how community housing providers can tap into it, but also we're saying that investor landlords who are gobbling up properties and having large portfolios, I think that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about owners who are sort of the problem, because the community housing providers in the room, by virtue, are in fact landlords themselves. My question is for Chris. Sorry, Chris. As an organisation that does two roles, Homeground and Launch, how do you balance that sticky ethical conversation where you're both providing community housing and a service that predicates itself on investor landlords? And what's your advice for organisations like ours who might consider in the future that they want to operate a rental role so that they can benefit communities that wouldn't access private rental otherwise?
Thanks, Ryan, for that question. What I would say is that delineation is really important, that Homeground, although it is an entity within Launch Housing, the strategy, the direction, the business model is completely different. I would say that if you're an organisation that's looking to go into this, firstly, as we do, come and talk to me, but secondly, you need to have a governance structure and a board that is motivationally fit to understand that profit for purpose. And it can't be all profit because, you know, as charities, we need to maintain a balance in our profitable endeavours. But in terms of a balancing act, it really, for me, as sort of the exec overseeing it, sometimes there's a bit of tension. But in terms of operationally, they're two different, very different units using a completely different CRM, treating the whole strategy completely separately. It's rare that we have that crossover. Sometimes we may have a renter within home ground whose situation changes and they may become eligible for social or community housing. That's when that could spur a conversation. But generally speaking, the entity, like the other chips in the room who have got that impact real estate, it's very separate. It's branded separate. And there's very good reason for that on both sides. It's about our rental portfolio, our group of home ground renters understanding that they are just renters like you and I, that they're not part of any sort of community housing. And for the landlords on the other side, they're getting the quality service that they would get from Ray White or a Jealous Craig, just that their profits are going back into a community organisation trying to build more houses.
Just up the back and then over here, so just there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Really great discussion thus far. My name is Leah. I work at Housing Choices Australia as policy advisor. I think this discussion has really highlighted this, and we touched on this a bit, this tension between an investment mindset versus a, I guess, social welfare mindset. And thinking about affordability and what it means to live in an affordable place, I'm wondering whether you're having conversations on a federal government level now about all these new developments that we want to deliver, to maybe implement different renting regulations, different frameworks and more protection for renters, and maybe different outcomes for investors. Because I think something that we're seeing is that on the one hand, everyone is complaining about the high rents while you're a renter. And once you own a place, you're quite inclined to also buy an investment property, right? So we need to shift this culture of once you own a property, you can't make a loss, right? This is what we're trying to prevent. And I think that mindset could be changed now that we have this momentum of the federal government looking at investing in housing, both home ownership, community housing, but just the rental place in general. So yeah, I was wondering, are there conversations? Are you advocating for this? Is this something on your minds, or what's the plan for the future?
Would you mind just summarising a question there? So what are you asking? Is it to resolve that conflict between?
Are you having policy discussions on federal government level to address this tension?
I suppose it's just, I don't personally, so perhaps I shouldn't be answering, but I sort of do the advice to the state level, but everything's quite connected. I suppose there's a kind of basic theory of change, if you like, to use our terminology, which is that if supply is alleviated, the tensions and the stresses won't be as stark. I suppose that's all I could probably say to that. But I would add that thing that I called for before, which is I really do think that owners and prospective owners need to be better informed, and then may not have quite such tough-edged kind of mindsets in some cases. And I mean, I'm obviously an optimist because I've been in this field for a really long time, and I do think that it's a community building move, like the gentleman over here from the West Australian Alliance was talking about, that if you do let out a property at a basically decent level and quality, then you are community building, and that's good for everybody, for all of us. So I suppose that there's just a few remarks. I'm not sure if that meets your question, but others might like to comment.
I think as an institute, yes, we're always advocating for, obviously, you know, there's a session at 4 o'clock, is supply the silver bullet, but it's definitely something we're advocating and, you know, across the whole housing continuum in different forms all the time. We're very big on advocating for the government to provide more social housing. We know that's a desperate need out there in all states. Along with obviously the rental incentives that are in place to help a tenant pay the rent that's currently in place in WA. So yeah, we very heavily advocate for all of those and more things to be in place. As I said, I would really welcome the Minister, considering he says there's no idea that's silly, and I think there could be an opportunity where owners are incentivised for, in some way on rates or something, to lower their rents as well.
Thank you. We'll have one more question here in the white shirt, and then I get my Spearsy moment of asking everyone for their...
Thank you. Sherry Broomhound here from Launch Housing. My question is to you, Heather. I'm aware in Victoria you've done a lot of listening with First Nations people of their experience of the private rental market, and just wondering if you would share some of those observations or give us some insights of what this looks like from a First Nations lens.
Thanks, Sherry. I was going to say something in my closing remarks, actually, because it really hadn't come up, this question of discrimination and the terrible situation, basically, where particularly private owners via their agents can instruct their agents, or, there's a sort of strange, almost kind of consensus that, you steer away from giving your property to someone who's First Nations or other, nominate other groups. But it's particularly pernicious, in my view, for Aboriginal Victorians and others living in Victoria. So as Sherry says, and Sherry was until recently on the other side of the fence in government managing homeless programs, there is a big effort in Victoria to sort of try and pick up some of that injustice, I suppose, around First Nations housing. That's going to take longer than the rest of the injustices, I think. But what I've done in my role is just try to listen and act on the directions that I've been given, I suppose, by the Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Forum, which is an extremely impressive, well-organised entity that's statewide, community-based, where all the agencies who have housing funding that are community-controlled have a voice. So when you've got something like that, and a role like mine, which is meant to be listening and relaying in, you'd be a fool not to sort of listen to it and do as much as possible to sort of just amplify in the spaces I get. So it has been my privilege and of deep interest to be able to work with the forum on that. So thanks for the question, Sherry, because it does remind me that we always need to be thinking about the discrimination question too, which is just baked in, it would appear, in too many cases.
Well, thank you, everyone. Sorry, I'm going to have to call time on questions. You've got one more very, very quick one. Comment here. So just down the front here.
My name's Victor Hunter. I'm from the Leon Foundation. And when we talk about Indigenous Australians into housing, we don't talk about home ownership in remote Indigenous communities. The situation we've got now is that all the blocks in a remote Indigenous community are on one lot number. Yeah. That prevents people in the community from accessing a housing loan from a financial institution, and it stops them from accessing the first $10,000 homeowners grant. There's the community title that we're looking at, and we're talking with the government about that. But we've got people who want to take out a housing loan and think Indigenous people have got to have skin in the game. Right now, they are the receivers of goods and services. We are the third biggest industry after mining and cattle in the Kimberley and the Pilbara. And these people are interested in getting access to a financial institution, a housing loan from there. We've got architects, engineers, and registered builders and tradespeople willing to work alongside them. And we've just recently been up into the community for the third time with a scale model, and the people are prepared to build their own houses under supervision. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this session. We all thought 90 minutes would drag on, but it's gone incredibly fast. So thank you, and thank you for your contributions and questions. So as I said, I will just turn to the panel now, starting with Chris, and ask you for your final observation.
Well, this is going to be a sell. No, not really. Look, one thing I wanted to say at some point through this is, you know, we've been doing a lot of work and a lot of research on our owners. Since January, we've got a portfolio in Melbourne CBD of around 400 rentals owned by about 280 different owners. 80 of those since January have sold. So there's an opportunity there that I think it shows that the investment market, even in Melbourne, which is a pretty soft market in terms of sales, there is a need to turn property over. So I would say we're currently going through the process of sort of investigating, well, how do I capitalise on those 80 sales and why can't I sell them? And then that same profit for purpose of real estate sales go back into a community organisation. So there's a bit of due diligence to be done there. But what I would say is I feel like home ground for another community housing provider is a unique value proposition to the market, to renters, to your board and supporters. So I would urge, 15 years ago when I started in this, and there are a couple of little home ground equivalents starting across Australia, and then they sort of fizzled out. This model, I think, is a model that sort of is a value add to a community housing organisation and renters. It's another form of affordable rental housing.
And I think, as Suzanne was saying earlier, it's an opportunity to change the dialogue around owner versus tenant into, or an owner being, a landlord and something despicable, into something really positive in the community to be, honoured. Heather?
I think I've already hammered the point about registration. I won't do that again, I don't think. I suppose I would say that what you just said sparked my thinking, Chris, because of course owners are going to sell, because basically in Australia you realise your gain, the capital gain is what you get. It's not so much for most people the rental, and that's one of the mistakes I think people can make, is thinking that they can get everything back on the rental. But in Australia it's a capital gain, and particularly at the life stage that a lot of people own investment properties, they're going to be selling them to fund their retirement, to fund whatever it is that they bought it for. So we've predicated a lot of our residential tenancies law and system on this kind of a bit of a fantastical notion that somehow the properties are really stable in there. But of course there's I see Chris Martin up there, who'll probably talk about this tomorrow, but there is a lot of sales, hey Chris, and a lot of properties don't stay all that long in the market because that's what they're bought for. They're bought at some stage to realise that capital gain. So again, just a first principle, I suppose, that we need to work with in this period where we are relying a lot on private rental to supply housing.
We are. They do a lot of the heavy lifting. I think it's just for us, it's constantly reminding policymakers and the public that it should not be owner versus tenant. You know, I think a healthy rental market is in everybody's interest, both owners and tenants alike. One final thing, what I'd really like to see is the stigma taken out of affordable and social housing. You know, a lot of times it's women like me that just end up with a marriage breakup at my age, and you know, this far away from being an affordable or social housing tenant. So I think we can do a lot better in that space of educating people, and I know we do a lot of work in my business about that around our tenants. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone, and please join me in thanking our panel. That's it for our session, so be safe, be well, and I think lunch is on now, so go and enjoy. Thanks everyone.
When I looked up, all I caught was the sun's rays on my face. Blinded eyes trace the skyline for an escape. My patient taste ain't tolerating in this case. In a world race, I'm campaigning for a change of pace. So I stand waiting, a lone man in a land that ain't vacant. Gotta